Cuba, an island that history has etched as the birthplace of one of the most profoundly influential leaders of the 20th century, will soon be forever linked with the name Fidel Castro, the man who led this country onto a path completely different from the rest of the Americas. Under his leadership after 1959, Cuba built a free healthcare system for all people, achieving one of the highest doctor-to-population ratios in the world, while carrying out large-scale literacy campaigns that helped more than 97% of the population learn to read and write in just a few decades, turning a poor nation into one of the most comprehensive education systems in the region. Cuba also became a symbol of independence from United States influence, standing firm throughout the Cold War, maintaining national sovereignty even when facing decades-long embargo measures. On the international stage, Castro's government sent tens of thousands of doctors and medical experts abroad, from Africa to Latin America, helping build the image of a small nation with great humanitarian influence, while he himself became a symbol of steadfastness, a man who could stand up to major powers and survive many global upheavals. But behind those achievements was another Cuba, where power was absolutely concentrated in the hands of the state, where the press was tightly controlled and dissenting voices were restricted or punished, especially during periods like the grey years of the 1970s when artists, intellectuals, and the LGBT community faced surveillance and repression. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans left their homeland, notably the Mariel event in 1980 when more than 120,000 people crossed the sea to the United States, carrying not only their belongings but also stories of shortages and control. The economy, despite achieving some social successes, remained heavily dependent on aid from the Soviet Union, and when that bloc collapsed in 1991, Cuba fell into the special period with electricity shortages, food shortages, and a prolonged crisis. During Castro's own lifetime, he witnessed personal losses, distance from family, complex relationships, and his final years in declining health after surgery in 2006. Before passing away in 2006, leaving behind a contradictory legacy, where significant achievements existed alongside the pain that a portion of the Cuban people still remember to this day. Before stepping into the story of the man who changed Cuba's destiny, please hit subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. That helps us continue bringing deeper perspectives on history, where every story has more than one truth. On the 13th of August 1926, in the rural area of Biran in Oriente Province, eastern Cuba, Fidel Castro was born into a situation that was both special and full of contradictions, a situation that would profoundly shape the path he chose later. His father, Ángel María Batista Castro y Argas, was an immigrant from Galicia, Spain, who had served in the military during the time when Cuba was still a colony, and later stayed on the island to seek opportunities over many years of work, including cooperation with American businesses like the United Fruit Company. Ángel Castro gradually built his own agricultural empire, owning thousands of hectares of sugarcane fields and employing more than 300 workers. In the context of rural Cuba in the early 20th century, this was a significant level of wealth, enough for the Castro family to live in conditions far beyond most people around them. However, Fidel's family background was not entirely stable by the social standards of that time. His mother, Lina Aruz Gonzalez, was initially a servant in Ángel Castro's household, and their relationship began while Ángel was still in his previous marriage. Therefore, Fidel was born out of wedlock, a factor that brought certain stigma in Cuban society at the time. In his early years, he did not carry his father's surname, but used his mother's, which reflected his not entirely clear position in the family structure. Later, when Ana formalized the relationship with Lina Ruz, Fidel and his siblings were officially recognized, but the initial experience of not belonging to a clear social order left a lasting mark on his personal awareness. Although he grew up in a family with means, the environment around Fidel was a completely different world. His family's plantation was the workplace for hundreds of workers, many of whom were immigrant laborers from Haiti and other Caribbean nations. They worked in harsh conditions, with low income, deprived lives, and almost no opportunity to improve their social status. From a young age, Fidel witnessed the stark contrast between his family's relatively comfortable house and the makeshift huts of the surrounding workers. These images were not abstract concepts but direct experiences that occurred daily in his life. In addition, his father's business relations with American companies also made Fidel early aware of the role of external forces in the Cuban economy. These companies were not simply business partners, but held significant control over land and production, thereby directly affecting the lives of workers. In a context where most profits from the sugarcane industry, Cuba's main economic sector, flowed abroad, while local workers still lived in poverty, this imbalance gradually became a big question for a boy observing the world around him. Fidel Castro's childhood therefore could not be simply described as poor or rich, but as an existence between the two opposing poles of Cuban society. On one hand, he had access to education and living conditions much better than many others. On the other hand, he constantly witnessed injustice right in the environment where his own family was a part. These experiences did not immediately turn him into a revolutionary, but they laid the foundation for how he viewed society, a system in which economic and political power was not distributed equally, and in which external factors, especially from the United States, played an important role in maintaining that imbalance. The following years in Fidel Castro's life marked an important shift from the rural environment of Iran to a highly disciplined education system, where elements of his thinking, ambition, and personality began to reveal themselves more clearly. As a child, Fidel was sent to study at schools run by the Jesuit order, first at Colegio Dolores in Santiago de Cuba, then at Colegio de Belén in Havana, one of the most prestigious high schools in Cuba at that time. The Jesuit schools were famous for their strict educational methods, emphasizing discipline, ethics, and a spirit of competition, and Fidel quickly adapted to this environment, not through absolute obedience, but by asserting himself within the framework he was placed in. At Colegio de Belén, Fidel was not known as an outstanding student academically, but he stood out in other areas, especially sports. In the years 1943 and 1944, he was recognized as one of the most prominent athletes in his age group in Havana, participating and competing in many sports such as baseball, basketball, and track and field. These activities not only reflected his physical fitness and dynamism, but also showed a strong competitive personality, a trait that would continue with him in the later stages of his life. In an educational environment where discipline was placed first, Fidel was not someone easily molded into a pattern. Instead, he showed a tendency to want to control situations and assert his personal will, even when that put him in opposition to the rules around him. In 1945, Fidel Castro entered a new phase when he enrolled in the law school of the University of Havana. This was not only a step forward in his educational path, but also a door that brought him into the center of Cuban political life. The University of Havana at that time was not simply an educational institution, but also a space where political, social, and even violent conflicts took place openly. Armed student gangs operated right on campus, many of which had connections with external political factions. Carrying weapons was not uncommon, and clashes between opposing groups frequently occurred, reflecting a larger society that was falling into instability and lack of control. In this environment, Fidel did not stand aside. He quickly joined student political activities, where he began to build a reputation as someone with strong oratory skills and a willingness to confront issues he considered unjust. One of the themes he focused on was the widespread corruption in the Cuban government, from the local to the central level. At the same time, he clearly expressed his stance against United States influence in the region, viewing it as a factor contributing to maintaining inequality and dependence of Latin American countries, including Cuba. In the late years of the 1940s, Fidel participated in many activities and organizations with left-wing tendencies, including student groups and political movements aimed at reforming or changing the system. He also had connections with organizations such as the Unión Insurreccional Revolucionaria, a group inclined to use violence to achieve political goals. Although he was not yet a prominent national leader, Fidel gradually became a notable figure in student circles and the press, especially after he appeared in newspapers with statements criticizing the government and the existing power structures. Also during this period, he began to engage in activities beyond Cuba's borders. In 1947, Fidel joined a campaign aimed at overthrowing the government of Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Although this campaign quickly failed due to being blocked by combined forces of several countries, this experience marked the first time Fidel directly participated in an armed effort to change politics. He escaped arrest by jumping off the ship and swimming to shore, a detail later repeated many times as proof of his daring and determination. In 1948, Fidel continued to expand his activities when he went to Bogotá, Colombia, to attend a Latin American student conference. This trip coincided with the time of the assassination of politician Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, leading to a large wave of riots known as the Bogotazo. Fidel was present in the city during this time and was said to have participated in activities in that chaotic context, although the specific level of involvement remains a subject of debate. However, this event further strengthened his awareness of political instability in the region and the role of mass movements in changing the existing order. Throughout his years at the University of Havana, Fidel Castro not only accumulated legal knowledge, but also formed a clearer view of power, systems, and methods to change society. He was no longer just an observer, as in his childhood at Biran, but had become an active participant in the ongoing political conflicts. The experiences in the university environment, where law, violence, and ideals coexisted, contributed to shaping a mindset that was not easily molded, a mindset ready to challenge existing structures when they did not meet the expectations of justice and independence that he was gradually forming. In 1948, amid the still turbulent student life in Havana, Fidel Castro entered a new personal phase when he married Mérida Díaz-Balart, a philosophy student from a family with status in Cuban society. The Díaz-Balart family had close ties to the political and economic circles, including figures connected to the current government, which created a combination that from the beginning contained opposing elements. For many observers, this marriage was a link between two different worlds. One side was a young man who was gradually becoming extreme in his political views. The other was a family attached to the system he frequently criticized. After the wedding, the couple had their honeymoon in the United States, a country that Fidel both observed and criticized in his speeches and activities. During his time in the US, he had direct contact with a developed industrial society, where wealth, consumption, and opportunities seemed to exist on a much larger scale than in Cuba. However, instead of softening his views, this experience seemed to further reinforce his awareness of the differences between nations and the role he believed the United States was playing in maintaining Cuba's dependence. The fact that a person criticizing American influence was at the same time enjoying the conveniences in that country was a clear paradox, but it also reflected a more complex reality in his life, where personal choices and political stances were not always aligned. In 1949, their first son, Fidel Castro Díaz-Balart, often called Fidelito, was born. This event marked Fidel stepping into the role of father, while also opening a period where family responsibilities began to intertwine with his increasingly deep political commitments. While Myrta came from a stable and well-off family, their married life did not fully reflect that stability. Fidel continued to devote most of his time to political activities, meetings, and organizing movements, while Myrta and her family expected a more traditional lifestyle. In the early years of the marriage, Fidel had the opportunity to get closer to the Cuban upper class through his wife's family. He participated in social events, met influential figures, and witnessed how power and wealth were maintained in a tightly knit network of relationships. These experiences provided him with a direct view of how the class he considered representative of injustice in Cuban society operated. However, instead of making him integrate into that environment, these contacts highlighted even more the differences between him and those around him. Parallel to family life, Fidel continued to actively participate in student movements and political activities against the government. He did not withdraw from the demonstrations or the organizations he had joined before, even though this could cause tension in his personal life. Maintaining two roles at the same time, a husband and father in a family with status, and an activist opposing the very system that his wife's family was connected to, created a state of prolonged contradiction. In the context of Cuban politics in the late 1940s, when corruption and instability continued to increase, Fidel increasingly believed that small changes in the existing system would not be enough to solve the core problems of the country. These views made him drift further away from the traditional political path that many in the upper class supported. Meanwhile, Myrta and her family tended to view the future in the direction of stability and integration within the existing framework, which increased the gap between the two sides. The contradiction between Fidel's personal life and his political ideals was not a single event, but a process that unfolded gradually. The choices he made during this period, prioritizing political activities, maintaining a stance in opposition to the system, and continuing to participate in high-risk movements, showed that his path was gradually separating from what a stable family life could offer. While he was still nominally part of the Diaz-Balart family, reality showed that he was shaping his own direction, a direction in which personal relationships had to give way to goals that he considered larger and more systemic. In the context of increasingly clear personal and political contradictions, Fidel Castro chose to join a more established path when he joined the Partido Ortodoxo, a political party founded by Eduardo Chibas in 1947 with the goal of fighting corruption and reforming the system from within. The party quickly attracted support from the middle class and students who believed that Cuba could still change through elections and democratic institutions. Castro, with his legal background and student activism experience, saw in the Partido Ortodoxo an opportunity to transform his views into legal political action. He began preparing for the congressional elections scheduled for 1952, with the goal of winning a deputy seat and from there directly participating in shaping national policy. During this period, Castro still believed that the political system, despite its flaws, could be reformed if there was enough pressure from within. He focused on building the image of a young, dynamic candidate with a clear stance against corruption, while maintaining connections with student circles and social activist groups. His speeches emphasized the need for transparency, justice, and economic independence, especially reducing dependence on foreign interests. However, this preparation took place in an increasingly unstable political environment, where military and political forces did not fully respect democratic rules. On the 10th of March 1952, just a few months before the elections were to take place, Fulgencio Batista carried out a military coup, overthrowing the incumbent government and cancelling the entire electoral process. This event happened quickly and almost without significant resistance from civilian institutions, reflecting the degree of weakening of the Cuban political system at that time. Batista, who had previously held the presidency from 1940 to 1944, returned to power with the backing of the army and acceptance from the United States, a country that considered him a stable partner in the region. With this coup, Cuba officially entered a period of military dictatorship, where power was concentrated in the hands of one individual and democratic control mechanisms were suspended. For Castro, the event of the 10th of March was not only a personal failure in his political plan, but also a decisive turning point in how he viewed the path to social change. The cancellation of the elections meant that all efforts to reform through the existing system became meaningless. The arguments he and his colleagues in the Partido Ortodoxo had once made about reforming from within no longer had any real basis. In his eyes, the system was not only flawed, but also controlled by forces unwilling to relinquish power through democratic means. After the coup, Castro tried to use the legal path to challenge the legitimacy of the new government. He filed a lawsuit against Batista to the Supreme Court, arguing that the coup violated the Cuban constitution. However, this lawsuit was not taken seriously and was quickly rejected, showing that the judicial system was no longer independent in the new context. This failure further reinforced Castro's conclusion that state institutions no longer functioned as mechanisms to check power, but had become tools of the military regime. In the following months, Castro began to shift from open political activity to building a network of secret operations. He gathered a small group of supporters, mostly students and young people with the same views, to discuss the possibility of using force to overthrow Batista's government. These meetings took place discreetly, avoiding surveillance by security forces, and gradually formed an initial organizational structure for a revolutionary movement. The shift from the political path to armed struggle did not happen immediately, but was the result of a series of events and evaluations. Castro was not the only one in his generation to reach this conclusion, but he was one of the few willing to act on it. He began studying other revolutionary models, including movements in Latin America and political theories related to overthrowing governments by force. At the same time, he also used his legal knowledge to better understand the structure of the state he was seeking to change. In this process, Castro maintained a certain level of public activity to avoid being noticed too early, but most of his energy was directed toward building a force capable of acting when the right time came. The members of his group were selected based on loyalty and commitment rather than military experience, and they began preparing for a specific action aimed at the symbol of the regime's power. These steps marked the formation of a new phase in Castro's life, where decisions were no longer limited by the rules of the system he had once tried to join, but were shaped by the goal of changing that system through more direct means. In the months after the secret network began to form, Fidel Castro and his supporters moved from the preparation phase to specific action with a clear goal: to attack a military symbol of Fulgencio Batista's government in order to trigger a broader uprising movement across the country. The chosen target was the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the second largest military base in the country, which was seen as representative of the regime's power. The plan was built in secrecy, with around 100 to 160 people participating, most of them young people without formal military experience, but with strong commitment to the goal of overthrowing the government. The attack was set for the 26th of July, 1953, coinciding with the Carnival Festival in Santiago, with the hope that the dispersion of security forces would create favorable conditions for seizing the barracks. On the early morning of that day, the attack groups moved by car, wearing military uniforms to create the element of surprise. However, from the first minutes, the plan began to encounter problems. Some vehicles got lost, communication between groups was not maintained effectively, and the element of surprise quickly disappeared when the defense forces at Moncada reacted in time. The battle took place in a short time, but with serious consequences. Castro's forces were overwhelmed by the regular army. Many were killed on the spot or after being captured. The failure was not only military but also exposed the entire network he had built over the previous months. After the attack was suppressed, a wide-scale manhunt was launched. Many members of the group were arrested in the following days, and some were executed without trial. Castro initially escaped into the rural area, but was quickly captured after a few days. He was taken to Santiago de Cuba to face trial for the crime of rebellion against the state. In a context where the government wanted to use the case as a warning to any opposition efforts, the trial was held with public and press attention. At the court, Castro chose to defend himself instead of using a lawyer, taking advantage of his legal knowledge to turn the trial into a political forum. In a speech that lasted several hours, later known by the name La Historia me absolverá, history will absolve me, he not only denied the legitimacy of Batista's government, but also presented a detailed political program for Cuba, including land reform, nationalization of key industries, and expansion of access to education and healthcare. This speech, although presented in a legal context, was in essence a political manifesto in which Castro tried to redefine his action not as a crime, but as a reasonable response to a system that he considered to have lost its legitimacy. The trial ended with Castro being sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was transferred to the prison on Isla de Pinos, the second largest island of Cuba, where he would begin serving his sentence along with some surviving comrades. The detention conditions here were relatively stable compared to other prisons, allowing him to maintain contact with the outside to a certain extent and continue political activities within limited scope. During his imprisonment, Castro and his associates organized discussion sessions, read books, and continued to develop ideas on how to organize a more effective revolutionary movement in the future. The failure at Moncada did not achieve the goal of overthrowing the government, but it created another impact, bringing Castro's name out of the student circle and making him a figure more widely known in Cuban society. The speech at the trial, although initially controlled, was later copied and circulated, contributing to building his image as someone willing to confront the government and presenting a specific vision for the country. While Batista's government considered the attack a failed act of rebellion, for Castro's supporters it began to be seen as a starting step for a longer process. During his time at Isla de Pinos, Castro did not abandon his original goal but continued to strengthen his belief that changing the system required a different strategy from what had been tested at Moncada. The organizational mistakes, lack of military experience, and inaccurate assessment of the government's reaction became practical lessons. He began to review the way to build forces, methods of approach, and timing of action, preparing for the next phase in which these elements would be adjusted. In 1955, in the context where Fulgencio Batista's government sought to reduce political pressure and improve its image before the international community, an amnesty order was issued for many political prisoners, including Fidel Castro and his comrades, detained after the Moncada event. After less than 2 years of serving his sentence at Isla de Pinos, Castro was released and quickly left Cuba, choosing Mexico as a place of exile to continue his activities. This decision was not only to avoid government surveillance, but also to allow him to reorganize his forces in a less controlled environment. In Mexico City, Castro began to rebuild his network from what remained after the 1953 failure. He contacted old supporters while recruiting new members, mostly Cuban exiles or individuals with the same views against the Batista regime. It was here that one of the most important encounters in his life took place, when Castro met Che Guevara, an Argentine doctor who had traveled throughout Latin America and was deeply influenced by the inequalities he witnessed. Guevara shared the view that the problems in the region could not be solved through small reforms but required revolutionary changes. The similarity in their worldview and political goals led the two men to quickly establish a close cooperative relationship. In the following months, Castro officially reorganized his group under the name Movimiento 26 de Julio, the 26th of July movement, named after the date of the Moncada attack. This name was not only symbolic but also aimed to maintain spiritual continuity between the previous failure and future plans. The movement was organized with a flexible structure, with small groups operating independently but coordinating with each other in order to minimize the risk of being detected or completely destroyed. Along with building the organization, Castro and his associates began to focus on military training. In Mexico, they rented land in the suburbs to conduct exercises on guerrilla tactics, weapon use, and survival in difficult conditions. Some members of the group with military experience or previous training played the role of instructors, while most had to learn from the beginning. The training process was not only to improve combat ability, but also to test each individual's level of commitment to the common goal. Those who did not meet the requirements for discipline or spirit were often removed from the group. During this time, Castro also faced many financial and logistical difficulties. Maintaining a semi-secret force in another country required significant resources, while external support sources were still limited. He sought to raise funds through personal relationships in the Cuban exile community, while taking every opportunity to purchase necessary weapons and equipment. Even so, resources remained minimal, forcing the group to rely heavily on flexibility and adaptability. In the late 2056, Castro's plan to return to Cuba gradually became clearer. Castro decided to use a small vessel to transport his forces from Mexico to the eastern coast of Cuba. The ship chosen was the Granma, a yacht about 18 meters long that was not designed to carry a large number of people or to navigate in rough sea conditions. However, due to financial limitations and available options, this was the most feasible plan. Castro and his associates began preparing for the journey, including gathering personnel, weapons, and planning the landing in the Oriente region, where he believed he could receive support from the local population. In the final days before leaving Mexico, Castro's group had grown to more than 80 people, a small force compared to the government army, but tightly organized and with clear objectives. All members were aware of the risks of the mission, including the possibility of being detected, being attacked immediately upon landing, or failing to establish a base in the interior. However, they continued with the plan, based on the assumption that an armed uprising, even if it started on a small scale, could spread if it received the support of the people and exploited the weaknesses in Batista's system. The preparation for the voyage on the Granma was not only a tactical move, but also a transition from the organizational phase to the action phase. The experiences from Moncada, the time in prison, and the period of exile in Mexico were accumulated into a specific plan, in which Castro and those who accompanied him bet on the ability to create change from a limited but clearly directed force. In November 2056, after many weeks of preparation in Mexico, Fidel Castro, along with about 82 people, left the port of Tuxpan on the Granma, beginning the journey back to Cuba with the goal of launching an armed uprising against Fulgencio Batista's regime. The ship, originally designed for far fewer passengers, had to carry an overload in unfavorable weather conditions, causing the journey to last longer than expected. This delay directly affected the plan to coordinate with rebel groups inside the country, which were expected to act simultaneously with the moment Castro's forces landed. When the Granma approached the eastern coast of Cuba in early December 2056, the element of surprise was almost gone. The landing took place in the Playa Las Coloradas area, a swampy region that was difficult to move through, causing the forces to become scattered and disorganized as soon as they set foot on land. In the days immediately following, Batista's army quickly detected and deployed forces to hunt them down. The first clash occurred at Alegria de Pio, where Castro's group was caught by surprise and attacked. Due to a lack of real combat experience, poor communication, and no solid defensive positions, the force was quickly forced into a passive position. Many were killed or captured, and the rest were forced to retreat in chaos. After this encounter, the initial force of 82 people was almost completely broken. Only about 15 to 20 people, including Castro, Raúl Castro, and Che Guevara, managed to regroup in the following days. They moved through dense forests and swamps, avoiding pursuit by the army, with limited food and water supplies. Survival in this period depended heavily on their ability to adapt and on support from some local people who provided information, food, and temporary shelter. The remaining group finally gathered in the Sierra Maestra mountain range, a rugged terrain area in southeastern Cuba. This was where they decided to establish a long-term base, taking advantage of the mountainous forest terrain to avoid direct attacks from the government army. The choice of Sierra Maestra was not only tactical, but also reflected an adjustment in Castro's approach after the failure at Moncada and the unsuccessful landing. Instead of direct attacks on large targets, the group began shifting to a guerrilla warfare strategy, focusing on small, flexible attacks and avoiding direct confrontation with the superior enemy forces. From the end of 2056 to 2058, the guerrilla war in Sierra Maestra gradually developed into an organized campaign. Castro's group established small units, assigned clear tasks, and built an internal communication system. They carried out attacks on small army outposts, seized weapons, and expanded their area of operations. At the same time, they also focused on building relationships with the local population, especially the peasants living in the mountain area. The support of the peasants played an important role in maintaining and expanding the force. Many of them had lived under difficult conditions under the current economic policies and had no direct connection with the central government. Castro's group, through actions such as sharing food, providing basic medical services, and committing to land reform, gradually gained the trust of this community. Some peasants joined the force directly, while others provided logistical support and information. During this process, the image of Castro and his movement began to spread beyond the Sierra Maestra area. International journalists, including reporters from the United States, sought to access the area to report on the uprising. One of the notable interviews was by Herbert Matthews from the New York Times in 2057, in which he described Castro as a leader who was still alive and commanding an organized force, contrary to previous information from Batista's government that he had been eliminated. This article helped raise international awareness of the movement and put pressure on the Cuban government. Meanwhile, Batista's army continued to launch campaigns aimed at destroying the guerrilla forces, including large-scale attacks on the Sierra Maestra area. However, due to the difficult terrain, lack of accurate information, and uneven fighting spirit in the army, these campaigns did not achieve decisive results. Some soldiers began to desert, or refused to carry out orders related to suppressing civilians, which further weakened the government's control. By the middle of 2058, Castro's forces had increased significantly in number and organization. From a small group that survived a failed landing, they became a force capable of conducting coordinated campaigns and expanding operations beyond the mountain area. New units were formed under the command of people like Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, with the task of advancing to other parts of Cuba to expand the front. This development reflected a process of transformation from an isolated rebel group into a nationwide influential movement. Throughout the period from 2056 to 2058, the guerrilla war in Sierra Maestra was not only a series of military engagements, but also a process of building organization, establishing legitimacy, and expanding the social base. These factors, combined with the gradual weakening of Batista's government, created conditions for the next phase in which the balance of power began to change markedly. By early 2058, after more than a year of guerrilla warfare in Sierra Maestra, the balance between Fidel Castro's forces and Fulgencio Batista's government began to change markedly. Although it still held advantages in troop numbers, weapons, and control of major cities, the government army increasingly faced difficulties in maintaining operational effectiveness. Large-scale military campaigns were launched to destroy the rebel forces in 2058, especially the attack on Sierra Maestra in the summer, which did not achieve the intended goals. The mountainous forest terrain continued to be an advantage for the guerrilla forces, while the fighting spirit of government soldiers declined due to harsh combat conditions, lack of motivation, and growing discontent within the ranks. Desertion in Batista's army became more common during this period. Some soldiers refused to participate in activities suppressing civilians, while others left their units due to a lack of confidence in the government's ability to win. These factors not only weakened military capability, but also affected the regime's image in the eyes of the public. Reports of abuse, torture, and killing of suspects further increased opposition from the people, especially in rural and suburban areas. At the same time as the weakening of the government army, the revolutionary movement began to spread beyond the Sierra Maestra area. Units led by commanders such as Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos were deployed to the central and western regions of Cuba, expanding the scope of the movement's operations. These campaigns included seizing small towns, sabotaging infrastructure, and establishing control lines on important transportation routes. The increasingly widespread presence of rebel forces forced Batista's government to disperse its troops, reducing its ability to concentrate efforts on any specific point. In the cities, especially Havana, groups of students, workers, and opposition organizations also increased their activities. Strikes, demonstrations, and acts of sabotage occurred more frequently, creating internal pressure on the government. Although many activities were suppressed, they still contributed to weakening the state's control and creating a continuous environment of instability. International media, which had already begun paying attention to the movement earlier, continued to report on developments in Cuba, increasing interest and pressure from outside. By the end of 2058, the situation became difficult to control for Batista's government. Important roads were disrupted, some cities fell into the hands of revolutionary forces, and public support for the central government dropped to a low level. In that context, on the night of December 31, 2058, Batista decided to leave Cuba along with some close associates and large assets, flying to the Dominican Republic. This departure took place without any prior official announcement, creating a sudden power vacuum at the political center of the country. After Batista left, the remaining military forces quickly lost direction. Some units surrendered while others withdrew or disbanded. Revolutionary groups advanced into the major cities without encountering significant resistance. On January 2, 2059, Castro's forces recaptured the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the site of his failed attempt 6 years earlier, this time in a completely different position. In the following days, Castro moved from eastern to western Cuba, stopping in many localities to speak and consolidate support. This journey was not only symbolic, but also a way to establish the presence of the new government across the country. On January 8, 2059, he entered Havana, the capital of Cuba, amid thousands of people pouring into the streets to welcome him. This event marked the end of Batista's regime and the beginning of a new phase in Cuba's history. Public support for the revolutionary movement at this time was an important factor in the transfer of power. Many people saw the change as an opportunity to end corruption, improve living conditions, and regain control over the nation's resources. Symbols of the old regime were removed, while slogans and images related to the 26th of July movement appeared widely. In the period immediately after taking power, Castro did not declare himself head of state, but supported the formation of a provisional government headed by Manuel Urrutia. However, with his role as commander of the Revolutionary Armed Forces and the central figure of the movement, he held decisive influence over political decisions. Members of the movement were appointed to important positions in the government and the military, creating a new power structure based on those who had participated in the armed struggle. This transition occurred quickly but was not entirely stable. While the majority of the people supported the change, there were still groups concerned about the direction of the new government, especially businessmen, landowners, and those connected to the old regime. However, in the early months of 2059, the broad support from the masses and the weakening of opposition forces allowed the new government to consolidate its position without encountering significant resistance. After entering Havana and establishing de facto control over the country, Fidel Castro did not immediately assume the highest leadership position, but initially supported a provisional government headed by Manuel Urrutia. However, the power structure quickly changed in the following weeks. When Prime Minister José Miró Cardona resigned and left Cuba, Castro was appointed Prime Minister in February 2059, officially taking over the executive powers of the government. In this position, he began implementing a series of policies aimed at restructuring Cuba's economy and society in the direction he had mentioned in previous statements. One of the first and most far-reaching steps was land reform. The Agrarian Reform Law was enacted in May 2059, limiting the scale of land ownership and allowing the government to expropriate large estates for redistribution to peasants. This policy directly affected large landowners, including wealthy Cubans and foreign companies, especially American businesses that held a significant portion of Cuba's agricultural land. The redistribution of land was welcomed by many peasants as a historic change, as for the first time they gained ownership or direct control over farmland. Alongside land reform, Castro's government proceeded with the nationalization of many key economic sectors. Enterprises in electricity, telecommunications, banking, and especially the sugar industry were successively brought under state ownership. Among them were many American companies that had operated in Cuba for decades. The seizure of these assets was carried out with compensation levels that the United States considered inadequate, leading to increasingly heightened tensions between the two countries. The Cuban government argued that these measures were necessary to restore economic sovereignty and ensure that national resources were used for the benefit of the country's people. While economic policies were being implemented, Cuba's political system also began to change. Traditional political parties were gradually removed from the decision-making process, and power became increasingly concentrated in the hands of the revolutionary government. By the early 1960s, Cuba shifted to a one-party model, with the Communist Party of Cuba playing a central role in directing policy and managing the state. Mechanisms for social control and surveillance were established, including local mass organizations to maintain stability and prevent opposition activities. In the early period of the new government, many Cuban people placed hopes on building a more just society. Education and healthcare programs were expanded, with the goal of providing free and universal services to the entire population. A nationwide literacy campaign was launched, mobilizing thousands of volunteers to rural areas to teach. These changes created a clear sense of a shift in the state's priorities, from serving a small interest group to focusing on the vast majority of the population. However, this transition also came with adjustments in the way society was managed. The press and media were brought under state control, and opposing voices were restricted in the public space. Some people who had initially supported the revolution began to express concerns about the degree of power concentration and the lack of independent oversight mechanisms. Nevertheless, in a context where the majority of the people was still experiencing concrete improvements in their lives. These views had not yet become a significant opposing force. In international relations, Cuba's policies quickly led to a change in the way this country was perceived. The nationalization of assets of American companies and the orientation of policies towards socialism made the United States view the Castro government as a direct challenge to its interests in the region. Economic and diplomatic measures were applied to put pressure on Cuba, while the government in Havana began to seek new partners to compensate for the losses from the disruption of trade relations with the United States. Inside Cuba, the forces that had participated in the revolution did not always share the same views on the next direction. Some members supported maintaining a pluralistic political system, while others, including Castro and his close associates, believed that the concentration of power was necessary to protect the achievements of the revolution against threats from within and without. These differences were gradually resolved in the direction of consolidating the role of centralized leadership, with Castro as the central figure in the decision-making process. In the first months and years after taking power, the new government of Cuba operated at a fast pace and on a broad scale, implementing changes that had previously been considered unfeasible within the framework of the old system. For many people, this was the time when promises of social justice began to be realized. At the same time, new power structures were also being established, shaping the way the country would be governed in the following decades. The rapid changes in Cuba's economic and political policies after 1959 not only transformed the social structure inside the country, but also placed Fidel Castro on an increasingly clear path of confrontation with the United States, the country that once had deep influence on this island. The nationalization of assets of American companies, along with public statements about the socialist orientation, made Washington view the new government in Havana as a threat in the context of Cold War tensions. Right from the end of 1959 and during 1960, economic and diplomatic measures were applied to put pressure on Cuba, including reducing sugar imports and restricting trade, while supporting groups of exiled Cubans to organize opposition forces. In that context, a military intervention plan was formed, with the participation of the United States Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, aimed at overthrowing the Castro government through a force composed of exiled Cubans. This force was organized under the name Brigade 2506, with about 1,300 members trained in Guatemala and Nicaragua. The goal of the campaign was to land in Cuba, establish a military beachhead, and trigger an uprising inside the country, thereby creating conditions for a change of government. The campaign was launched in April of 1961. On April 15th, airstrikes were carried out against several Cuban military airfields, with the aim of weakening the air force before the landing. However, these attacks did not achieve the expected effectiveness, and at the same time clearly revealed the involvement of the United States. 2 days later, on April 17th of 1961, Brigade 2506 forces began landing in the Bahia de Cochinos area, also known as the Bay of Pigs, located on the southern coast of Cuba. Right when the landing began, Cuban defense forces reacted quickly. Local militia units and regular army were mobilized to stop the invading forces. Fidel Castro personally participated in commanding the counterattack operations, moving to the combat area and coordinating units on the ground. Castro's appearance at the front line not only had military significance but also had a psychological impact on the defense forces, strengthening the fighting spirit in the context of confrontation with a force supported from outside. In the first hours, Brigade 2506 encountered stronger resistance than expected. The plan was based on the assumption that there would be support from local people or a simultaneous uprising in the interior, but this did not happen on a significant scale. On the contrary, many people and militia forces participated in resisting the landing. At the same time, the lack of direct air support from the United States, due to political considerations from the John F. Kennedy administration, prevented the invading forces from maintaining their initial advantage. Within 3 days, from April 17th to April 19th of 1961, the fighting took place continuously with increasingly unfavorable results for Brigade 2516. Supply lines were cut, transport vehicles were destroyed, and the forces were isolated in the landing area. By April 20th, most of the invading forces had been eliminated or forced to surrender. About more than 100 people were killed, and more than 200 people were captured by Cuban forces. For the Castro government, this result was seen as a symbolic and strategic victory. The repulsion of an invasion supported from outside in a short time consolidated the legitimacy of the government and increased domestic support. This event was also used to affirm that Cuba was facing a real threat from the United States, thereby justifying the strengthening of internal control and the consolidation of a centralized political structure. Meanwhile, in the United States, the failure of the Bay of Pigs campaign was seen as a serious mistake in foreign policy. The administration of President Kennedy faced domestic criticism and international pressure as the intervention in a sovereign country was exposed without achieving the set goals. Although the United States later negotiated to exchange prisoners for humanitarian goods worth tens of millions of dollars, this event still left long-term consequences in the relations between the two countries. After the Bay of Pigs, Cuba-United States relations shifted to a state of open and prolonged confrontation. Economic embargo measures were expanded, while Cuba strengthened relations with the Soviet Union and the Socialist bloc countries. Inside Cuba, the government continued to consolidate the security and surveillance system with the reason of protecting the country against threats from outside. Mass organizations and militia forces were expanded, forming a widespread social control network. The event in April of 1961 was not only a short-term military clash, but also a turning point in shaping Cuba's position on the global political map. From a country in the process of internal restructuring, Cuba became a hotspot in the confrontation between the great powers, with an increasingly clear role in the developments of the Cold War. At the same time, for Castro and his government, the outcome of the invasion reinforced the belief that the path they were pursuing needed to be protected by all necessary means in the context of increasing pressure from outside. After the failure of the landing at the Bay of Pigs, the government of Fidel Castro increasingly believed that another military intervention from the United States was only a matter of time, and in that context seeking a security guarantee from outside became a strategic priority. The relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union, which had already been strengthened before, began to move into a phase of deeper cooperation when the two sides reached a secret agreement in 1962, according to which the Soviet Union would deploy medium-range and long-range ballistic missiles on Cuban territory in order to create a deterrent shield against any invasion from the United States. This deployment was carried out discreetly during the summer months of 1962, with military equipment, including missiles and nuclear warheads, being transported by sea from the Soviet Union to Cuba and installed at many locations on the island, while the Cuban side provided the necessary infrastructure and support forces for this process. By October 14th of 1962, a United States U-2 reconnaissance aircraft had captured images of missile launch sites being built, and only 2 days later, President John F. Kennedy was informed about the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba, marking the beginning of the crisis that later came to be called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Faced with this information, the Kennedy administration had to confront a series of options, from direct airstrikes on the missile facilities to carrying out a full-scale invasion, but ultimately decided to apply a measure called quarantine, which was in fact a naval blockade aimed at preventing ships carrying military equipment from approaching Cuba, while avoiding the use of the term blockade so as not to be considered an act of declaring war. On October 22nd of 1962, Kennedy spoke on national television announcing the presence of the missiles and the decision to impose the quarantine, while warning that any attack from Cuba would be considered an act of the Soviet Union against the United States, placing the entire situation into a state of direct confrontation between the two superpowers. In the following days, United States warships deployed around the Caribbean area to inspect and stop Soviet ships, while in Cuba, military forces were placed in a state of high combat readiness. Air defense systems were activated and the people were mobilized to participate in defense activities, creating an atmosphere of widespread tension across the entire island. For Castro, this situation was not only a confrontation between two great powers, but also a matter of survival for his government. and he sent messages to the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, expressing the view that if the United States carried out an invasion, the Soviet Union should consider using nuclear weapons in response, a stance that showed the level of willingness to accept risk in the context that he believed Cuba was being directly threatened. Meanwhile, in Washington and Moscow, diplomatic exchanges took place continuously, with messages sent through many different channels aimed at seeking a solution that could avoid full-scale conflict. From October 24th to October 27th, tensions reached their peak when some incidents occurred, including the shooting down of a United States U-2 aircraft over Cuban skies, increasing the risk of military escalation. During these days, the world stood before the possibility of a nuclear war, as both sides had armed forces in a state of high readiness and decisions were made in a very short time. Finally, an agreement was reached through secret and public diplomatic channels, according to which the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba under international supervision, while the United States committed not to invade Cuba and agreed, in a way not immediately made public, to withdraw its own missiles from Turkey. By October 28 of 1962, Nikita Khrushchev announced the decision to withdraw the missiles, and the 13-day crisis officially ended, leaving behind a changed international relations system in which Cuba still maintained its political independence, but at the same time also became a key point in the global confrontation structure of the Cold War. After the missile crisis ended at the end of October of 1962, the position of Fidel Castro inside the country was clearly consolidated, as his government not only overcame a large-scale international confrontation, but also maintained the existence of the new political system in the context of continuous pressure from outside. In the following years, Cuba entered a phase of building and shaping a social model that the government called comprehensive revolution, in which the state played the central role in organizing economic life, education, and healthcare for the entire population. One of the top priority areas was healthcare, when the government deployed a free healthcare system nationwide, expanded the network of hospitals, clinics, and trained teams of doctors. Vaccination programs, disease prevention, and community healthcare were widely implemented, contributing to the improvement of indicators such as life expectancy and infant mortality rate. For many decades, Cuba achieved a level of health coverage that many other developing countries could hardly reach, and this system became one of the most mentioned points when evaluating the legacy of Castro. Alongside healthcare, education was also placed at the center of the social development strategy. Right from the beginning of the 1960s, a large-scale literacy campaign was deployed, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of volunteers to rural areas to teach those who could not read or write. The result of this campaign was that the literacy rate increased rapidly in a short time and continued to be maintained in the following years through a universal education system. By the end of the 20th century, the literacy rate in Cuba was estimated to exceed 97%. A high figure compared to many countries in the Latin America region. Schools and universities were nationalized and expanded, with the goal of providing learning opportunities for all social classes, including women in groups that previously had little access to education. However, along with the achievements in the social field, the political system in Cuba also developed in a more centralized and tightly controlled direction. The press, radio, and television were placed under state management, and media content had to conform to the political orientation of the government. Opposition voices were restricted in the public space, and political organizations outside the Communist Party had no role in policymaking. The social surveillance system was established through local organizations, where people were encouraged to participate in monitoring and reporting activities considered to be against the revolution. In the 1970s, the period later called the Grey Years, measures of cultural and social control were significantly strengthened. Many writers, artists, and intellectuals were censored or had their activities restricted if their works did not conform to the official line. Forms of art considered deviant or individualistic were criticized, while cultural organizations were required to strictly comply with state regulations. The LGBT community also suffered heavily during this period, when many people were discriminated against, lost their jobs, or were sent to re-education programs with the aim of adjusting behavior according to the social norms set by the government. These policies reflected a view that maintaining unity of thought and action was necessary to protect the political system against threats from outside and inside. However, they also created long-term consequences for cultural life and personal freedom of the people. Some individuals and groups began to find ways to leave Cuba. Although migration was not always easy or permitted, after 1980, accumulated social and economic pressure over many years led to a large-scale event, the Mariel Boat Lift. After a group of people sought asylum at the Peruvian embassy in Havana, the government decided to open the port of Mariel, allowing anyone who wanted to leave Cuba to do so for a limited period of time. Within more than 6 months, from April to October of 1980, more than 120,000 Cubans left the country, mainly to the United States, especially the state of Florida. This event not only changed the demographic structure of Cuba, but also had a significant impact on the Cuban community in the United States, where the new migrants faced many challenges in integrating. The Mariel Boat Lift also reflected a complex reality in Cuban society. While many people continued to support the system led by Castro, others chose to leave when they had the opportunity, for economic, political, or personal reasons. The Cuban government, during this process, allowed some people considered unfit for revolutionary society to leave, while using the event as a way to reduce internal pressure. Throughout the decades from 1960 to 1980, Cuba, under the leadership of Fidel Castro, developed according to a model that both expanded basic social services and maintained a tightly controlled political system. These policies brought concrete results in the fields of healthcare and education, while creating limits on personal freedom and expression. The parallel existence of these two elements, a system of provision and a system of control, became a prominent feature of Cuban society during this period, shaping the way the country operated and was perceived in the following decades. Moving into the late 1980s, changes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union began to create profound impacts on Cuba, where the economy for many years had depended heavily on aid, preferential trade, and energy supplies from the socialist bloc. By 1991, when the Soviet Union officially dissolved, Fidel Castro faced one of the most serious crises throughout his entire time in power. When Cuba almost lost the main economic support that had sustained the operation of the system for the previous 3 decades, this collapse was not only a geopolitical event, but also a direct shock to every aspect of Cuban life, from industrial production, agriculture to transportation and daily consumption. The Cuban government called this period the Special Period in Time of Peace, a political expression aimed at emphasizing that the country was going through a crisis equivalent to wartime even. Though there was no direct military conflict, in reality, the Cuban economy in the early 1990s declined by about 35 to 40% compared to the level before 1990, a level of decline rarely seen in peacetime. Factories lacked raw materials, the transportation system was paralyzed due to lack of fuel, and agricultural output dropped sharply when imported fertilizers and equipment were no longer supplied as before. In daily life, Cuban people began to feel the changes clearly. Electricity was cut alternately on a large scale, with some areas having to live in a state of power outages for many hours each day. The lack of fuel made vehicles almost disappear from the streets, forcing many people to switch to using bicycles or walking. Food became scarce, rations were reduced, and people had to look for alternative sources to maintain their livelihood. Images of empty stores, long lines of people waiting to buy food, and rudimentary means of transportation became characteristic of Cuba during this period. Faced with that situation, the Castro government was forced to implement a series of adjustments that had previously been little accepted in the centralized economic model. From 1993 onward, the government began to allow some small-scale private economic activities, including individual businesses in the service sector, such as restaurants, repairs, and transportation. At the same time, the use of the US dollar was legalized in some transactions in order to attract foreign currency from outside, especially from the Cuban community abroad. One of the priority areas for development was tourism. The government opened the door for foreign investors to participate in building hotels, resorts, and infrastructure to serve tourists. especially from Europe and Canada. Coastal areas and cities with historical value were renovated to attract international visitors, and the tourism industry gradually became one of the most important sources of foreign currency for Cuba in the 1990s. This change marked a shift in economic policy when the state accepted the existence of some market elements in a system that still maintained a centralized political structure. Besides the economic adjustments, the government also sought to maintain social stability in the context of difficulties. Food distribution programs according to quotas continued to be maintained to ensure a minimum standard of living for the people. The healthcare and education systems, although under resource pressure, were still prioritized to keep operating. At the same time, social control mechanisms were strengthened to prevent any instability that might arise from the economic situation. In the international context, Cuba had to seek new partners to replace the previous role of the Soviet Union. Relations with some Latin American countries were improved, and in the following years, Cuba established economic cooperation relations with countries such as Venezuela, which supplied oil in exchange for healthcare and education services from Cuba. These agreements helped somewhat alleviate energy pressure and created conditions for the economy to gradually recover after the deep decline period. Throughout the special period, a big question was raised as to whether the political system in Cuba could survive when it lost its previous economic foundation or not. Many other socialist countries had undergone transformation or collapse in the same period, but in Cuba, Fidel Castro still maintained power and control over the state apparatus. This was partly due to his strengthening of the role of the army and security agencies, while maintaining support from a segment of the population, those who still viewed social policies such as healthcare and education as achievements that needed to be protected. Castro's speeches during this period often emphasized Cuba's resilience and self-reliance, while criticizing the United States' economic embargo measures as a factor that aggravated the crisis. This message was repeated for many years, creating an interpretive framework in which economic difficulties were seen as consequences of external factors as well as internal challenges. Although facing unprecedented difficult conditions, the political system in Cuba did not collapse but instead adapted through controlled adjustments. The combination of limited economic reforms, maintaining basic social services and tight political control, allowed the government to overcome the crisis period of the early 1990s and move into a state of relative stability in the following years. Even though problems of productivity, income, and access to goods continued to exist in Cuban society. Moving into the 2000s, after many decades of maintaining power in the context of continuous changes in the world, Fidel Castro began to face health limitations, a factor that had previously rarely been made public in a system that tightly controlled the image of the leader. In July of 2006, after experiencing an incident related to intestinal illness and having to undergo emergency surgery due to internal bleeding, he was forced to temporarily transfer power to his brother, Raúl Castro, who had held a key role in the system from the early days of the revolution. This was the first time since 1959 that Fidel Castro did not directly run the country, and this event quickly attracted attention both inside and outside Cuba, as it raised questions about the future of a system tied to one individual for nearly half a century. After the initial period following the power transfer, information about Castro's health condition was released in a limited way, with official statements emphasizing that the transfer was only temporary. However, as time passed without him returning to the leadership position, it became clear that a new phase had begun. By February of 2008, Castro officially announced his resignation, ending nearly 49 years of continuously holding the highest positions of power in Cuba, from Prime Minister to President of the Council of State and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This decision was presented as a necessary step due to his health condition, not allowing him to continue performing daily executive duties, while paving the way for Raúl Castro to officially become the head of state, even though he no longer held official positions. Fidel Castro did not completely withdraw from political life. In the years that followed, he still appeared through articles published in Granma, the official newspaper of the Communist Party of Cuba, where he commented on international issues such as regional conflicts, climate change, and the danger of nuclear war. He also received some foreign leaders and participated in symbolic meetings, showing that his influence still existed in the system, even if he was no longer directly running it. Castro's image during this period shifted from an active leader to a symbolic figure representing the history and continuity of the Cuban Revolution. On November 25th of 2016, Fidel Castro passed away in Havana at the age of 90 after a long period of declining health. The news of his death was officially announced by Raúl Castro on national television, and immediately afterward a series of memorial ceremonies were held across the country. His ashes were taken along the route that the revolutionary forces had traveled from the Sierra Maestra to Havana in 1959, before being buried at Santa Ifigenia Cemetery in Santiago de Cuba. For many Cuban people, this was the moment marking the end of an era tied to one individual, while for the international community, reactions to his passing reflected the division in how his legacy was perceived. After Castro's death, Cuba continued to be governed under a one-party model, with the Communist Party of Cuba maintaining the central role in the political system. Raúl Castro continued to lead for a period, before transferring power to the new generation of leaders, but the basic structure of the system remained unchanged. Limited economic reforms were expanded in some areas, including allowing small private businesses and strengthening cooperation with international partners. But the core elements of the political system, including media control and restrictions on opposition, did not change significantly. Fidel Castro's legacy is a complex and controversial topic, not only inside Cuba but also around the world. On one hand, his supporters emphasized the achievements in healthcare and education, where Cuba achieved notable indicators compared to many countries with similar income levels. The free healthcare system, widespread network of doctors and medical training programs became highlights in Cuba's development model. Similarly, the universal education system with a high literacy rate and broad access was seen as a success in reducing inequality in learning opportunities. On the other hand, critics focused on the limitations on personal and political freedoms under Castro. Control of the press, restrictions on opposition parties, and social surveillance were considered factors that undermined human rights. Many Cubans chose to leave the country at different times, seeking economic opportunities and political freedom elsewhere, creating a large Cuban exile community, especially in the United States. These different experiences led to different perceptions of the same historical period. In that context, the question about Fidel Castro's role in Cuban history still has no unified answer. For some, he was the one who ended a corrupt and dependent system, bringing Cuba to a more independent development model and providing basic social services to the entire population. For others, he was the one who established a system that concentrated power, restricted freedom, and maintained control for many decades. Between these two views, there exists a wide space of intermediate opinions, where positive and negative elements are considered simultaneously. Looking back at the entire journey from Biran to Havana, from a law student to a leader who lasted nearly half a century, Fidel Castro was not only an individual, but also part of a larger historical period, where nations, ideologies, and people interacted in a complex global context. The choices he made, the policies implemented, and their consequences continue to influence Cuba and the way the world perceives this country. And as the story closes, what remains is not only the events that occurred, but also open questions about how to evaluate a man who shaped, and at the same time was shaped by, his own era. The story of Fidel Castro shows a very clear paradox. A man who could both create profound positive changes and leave behind long-term controversial consequences. From a young man who grew up amid inequality in Biran, he witnessed the wealth gap and the influence of foreign companies, which later drove him to choose the path of struggle. His abandonment of the electoral path after the 1952 coup and shift to armed struggle, especially through the failure at Moncada and then reorganization in Mexico, shows a clear lesson. Major falls can become the foundation for more decisive steps if a person is persistent enough. However, that very persistence also led to a tightly controlled system after he took power from press censorship. The Gray Years, to hundreds of thousands of people leaving Cuba during the Mariel event. For the people of the United States, the lesson is not only in praising or criticizing a historical figure, But in understanding that power and ideals always need to be balanced, achievements such as the free healthcare system and the literacy rate of more than 97% show that correct policies can change an entire country. But at the same time, the restriction of personal freedom and social control also reminds us that any system lacking mechanisms to check power can go off course. In a democratic society like the United States, where freedom and institutional checks are valued, this story is a reminder that citizen participation, transparency, and the balance of power are not self-evident, but need to be continuously maintained. If the story of Fidel Castro makes you think about power, ideals, and the price of change, please hit subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the figures who have shaped world history